Welcome to St. John the Evangelist Anglican Church in Ottawa for Session 3 and our final part of our study of the book of the Acts of the Apostles. Each of these 20-minute videos has formed an introduction to a discussion session on Zoom, and you are welcome to join us on Tuesday, May 31st at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Should the timing not work for you, I hope these videos and the concluding discussion questions will be helpful for your own reflections. My name is Gary Vandermeer, and I am the pastor and rector of St. John's. Our St. John's congregation has felt a real connection with the story of the Church of St. Martin-in-the-Fields in London, especially as their vicar, the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, addressed our Anglican Diocese of Ottawa in a recent special lecture. With our downtown location, proximity to government and the arts, and a significant commercial area, we felt a strong identification with how Sam Wells describes the challenges of St. Martin-in-the-Fields. I would encourage you to watch Sam Wells and see if his description fits for you as well. You will find the link in the description for this video. Let's be totally transparent that the way St. Martin's has identified and demonstrated a trajectory of growth was also very appealing to us. We are interested to learn from their approach to community based on what Sam Wells calls the 4 C's: commerce, culture, compassion, and congregation. And when Sam Wells made a provocative comparison between our times and the early church, we found ourselves intrigued by what the story of the early church in the book of Acts might teach us. So for this, our final session with Acts, let's consider how growth of the early church takes place in the book of Acts. This theme of rapid growth could easily take us beyond the book of Acts, where there are many theories about the growth curve from a group of 12 people, or perhaps a network of some 30 people, to the majority of people in the Roman Empire in a very short period of time. Before we delve into Acts, here are 2 of these accounts of the incredible growth of the early church. First, Rodney Stark's 1997 book, The Rise of Christianity, subtitled How the Obscure Marginal Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religious Force in the Western World in a Few Centuries. Stark's theory is filled with idealism. The Christians were compassionate. They cared for plague victims when other people abandoned them, and a higher proportion of those plague victims that they cared for survived, and many converted to Christianity because they were impressed by the kind-hearted example of their Christian caregivers. A second account takes a much darker perspective. On the history hit podcast The Ancients, host Tristan Hughes interviews Catherine Nixie about her book The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World. Christianity, after its legalization, moved into a period of intolerance, including the destruction of temples, notably the most beautiful temple in Alexandria, the Temple of Serapis, and the forced conversion of thousands in massed baptisms. Notably, in 529, the Christian Emperor Justinian set an edict forcing the conversion of the entire school of philosophy in Athens, which had persisted as the golden chain from the age of Plato. After years of vandalism and intolerance, beatings and torture of philosophers, many Athenians had pragmatically converted. But at this point, the entire faculty of philosophy went into exile in Persia. While these later developments tell a range of perspectives, both positive and negative, let's now confine ourselves to the book of Acts. Acts chronicles impressive numbers of people converting. 3,000 were baptized in response to Peter's Pentecost sermon in chapter 2. And then by the end of the chapter, many more day to day as they sold their possessions to help those in need, and as they lived their early Christian proto-communism of sharing everything and breaking bread together. The sermon by Peter and John in chapter 4 yields another 5,000 converts. There were more after healings in chapter 5, And in chapter 6, the church creates deacons to serve the needs of the community, with the result that many more, even priests, are said to join the Christian movement. And on it goes throughout the book. We could challenge these numbers, and many have done so. One writer compared these numbers to fishing and the question, how big was it, to imply that the story grew in the telling. But letting go of the actual numbers, the single most effective means of bringing followers to Jesus in the book of Acts was the preaching. It was also the preaching that alienated many listeners, but it is the sermons by Peter, John, Stephen, Philip, and especially Saul, who became known as Paul, whose sermons and travels make up more than half the book of Acts. There were miracles and good deeds for the poor and the warmth of the table fellowship, but it was especially said to be the preaching that brought about conversions. This brings us to a dilemma. If we consider Paul's sermons in the book of Acts, they bear a closer resemblance to all the other sermons in Acts than they do to Paul's own style of writing in his letters, which we have in the New Testament. In fact, these two versions of Paul are so divergent that biblical scholars differentiate between actual Paul and Luke's Paul, as he is written in the book of Acts. It is Luke who gives us the interpretation of what those sermons would have been. Paul does mention a Luke who traveled with him, and that's how we come to have the tradition that the travel narratives, which are called the we sections, are actually Luke's first-hand account of his travels with Paul. However, it appears that Luke has freely internalized Paul's preaching and all the other sermons into his own way of speaking. There is a pattern to all these sermons, which indicates that they come from the same person, regardless of who is giving them. For the ones that are addressed to Jews, they tell them that this Jesus, whom you crucified, God has raised up. Of all these sermons, actually the most unique one is the one he gives in Athens. It is not addressed to the Jews of the synagogue in Athens, but to the city of philosophers, to the city of temples of many gods. I'm now going to read it, and then it will become the focus of our discussion of how growth happened then and how it happens now. A reading from Acts chapter 17, verses 16 to 34. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling them the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it. He who is Lord of heaven and earth does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times and their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Paul starts from respect for the setting in which intellectual inquiry and debate are the norm. He speaks to an audience of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and he begins from where they are. He even quotes from their writings with respect, so much so that those writings have passed into our Christian language of prayer. In our translation of the Bible, there are quotation marks around "In him we live and move and have our being," although quotation marks wouldn't have been found in the original source. And that source is the Greek poet Epimenides, though this is disputed by some scholars. And this phrase is now commonly used in formal Christian prayers. But the next phrase is also well known. "For we too are God's offspring," comes from the Greek poet Aratus from the 3rd century before the Common Era. It's interesting that Paul's sermon does not focus on Jesus. He's rather tacked on at the end. Instead, in a setting of other religions, he starts from God, God as the creator, God as the preserver and sustainer of life. And then Paul challenges the Greek understanding. No statue of an unknown God has been found, but Paul stakes a claim on who that unknown God is. And then he undercuts the Greek classical understanding in this way. If we are God's offspring, it is not just that God lives in us, which is found in Stoic philosophy, but that we live in God. So he starts from respect and common ground, and then he challenges. Or if I could make an analogy from life today, it kind of feels like what an expert sales rep might do, whether selling insurance or cars or any other major product. Start from what we have in common, and then move into presenting something that fulfills a need and sell. There's a fun theory about this, and that is that when they take Paul to the Areopagus, an area for public speaking, Luke is invoking the trial of Socrates. Without even naming him, people would have known that this is a literary representation where Paul speaks to everyone, just as Socrates did. The people think he is introducing new gods, which is what they thought Socrates was doing. Paul stands in a kind of court, and it's the court that was the one that led to Socrates' death. Luke is saying, on a literary level, that this is a high-stakes interaction between the apostle and the intelligentsia of Athens. And his speech, interestingly, does not attack the religious theorizing of these philosophers, who would be more interested in ideas than idols. But Paul does criticize the worship of images or idols. In a way, Paul is speaking past these philosophers directly to the practices of the people of the city of Athens. They already honor a God that they do not know, despite their outward practices with idols, is what Paul is saying. Paul's sermon here appears to lay a groundwork for how to Christianize philosophy and culture. The Christianity portrayed is more than ready to be syncretistic, to use other religious traditions in order to make the gospel intelligible to non-Christian cultures. This moves us into our own world, our world of interreligious dialogue and understanding, our world of different cultures being together. Over the centuries and millennia, different methods have been used to present the gospel. I have already referenced some of the more intolerant versions, including the destruction of their temples, statues, and literature, the terrorizing of their adherents, and forced conversions. But over the centuries, evangelism has also been about dialogue, about appreciating, and even about adopting the wisdom and insights of other traditions. As we reflect on how to present faith in the context of contemporary, urban, secular Ottawa, what's appropriate and what will work for us? If we look again at the example of St. Martin-in-the-Fields, what's working for them is a kind of convergence of a humming building that gathers people through 4 focus areas: commerce, culture, compassion, and congregation. It seems that such a convergence is more like Acts chapter 2, where people see the locus of compassionate service, vibrant culture, and the warmth of table fellowship, and that they are then drawn in. But drawn in is a short form for a process that involves observing, listening, questions, and dialogue. How do we address that part? One resource that I have found helpful is the book The Ethics of Evangelism by Elmer John Thiessen. Thiessen's ideas are further developed in another book called The Scandal of Evangelism. When it comes to ethics, he says, we should be focused on the dignity and well-being of the person we are speaking to. Thiessen applies this to 4 categories: the evangelism of children, evangelism in professional life, evangelism as human aid, and the ethics of proselytism, or as he calls it, sheep stealing from other traditions. Thiessen creates what he calls the golden rule of evangelism. Evangelize others as you yourself would be evangelized. The golden rule of evangelism, in other words, is share the good news as you would want it to be shared with you. For myself, if I could go back into my memories, preaching does matter. Acts says it matters, and it's mattered for me. Walking into a church and not knowing what to think or whether I even belonged there, and hearing a sermon that actually reached me was so significant. If that's a repeat of Paul at the Areopagus, then I would want to say, bring it on. But that's not the only thing. There's testimony, people telling their own story of their journey in faith. There's authenticity, the honesty and humility of telling what's important to you. And for another one for me, there's movies that get at what it means to struggle with being human. What is the best way that someone has shared good news with you? We all have the stories of how it didn't work, or even where it's offensive. But what is the way that you actually appreciated when someone shared it with you? And if you have ever talked about your faith with someone, how did you do it? And how did it go? What did you focus on? What would you say to someone who is attracted to the hum of lots of things happening at St. John's? What would you say as a part of dialogue?